Hello friends, it's February the 5th, 2021, and I'm delighted on behalf of the Oxford Prospects and Global Development Institute to welcome you to this, our second In Conversation series. It's a series between academics and policymakers in the UK and China. And together with the Institute Director, Dr. Shidong Wang, I want especially to acknowledge the support for today's event of our partner university, Jilin University, where indeed Professor He is based. This series of online conversations will explore some of the challenges in the current global context where social and political unrest, economic disorder, and ecological disaster are all intersecting and intensifying divisions within and between nations. The series will include academics from a range of disciplines, from law, politics, international affairs, ecology, and economics. Drawing upon their research and professional practice, they will offer expert analysis of the complex nature of conflict and division and enable us to think more deeply about how perhaps these divisions can be transformed into opportunities for building and restoring cooperation and human community. Today's first in the series is titled Restoring International Relations, Prospects for Revitalising Global Cooperation Through the Application and Practice of International Law. And we have two legal experts, highly professional in international law, as our panelists and conversation partners. Sir Malcolm Evans is Professor of Public International Law at the University of Bristol. He's a member of the chair of the UN Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture, and from 2014 to 15 was chair of the Meeting of Chairs, that's a very UN phrase, chair of the Meeting of Chairs of the UN Human Rights Treaty bodies. He's also a member of the UK Foreign Secretary's Human Rights Advisory Group. From 2002 to 2013, he was a member of the OSCE Advisory Council on the Freedom of Religion or Belief. And he is currently co-general editor of the International and Comparative Law Quarterly and co-editor-in-chief of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. He's also a member of the Commission on Religious Education, established by the Religious Education Council, and a member of the Panel of Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse in England and Wales, which was established by the Home Secretary in 2015. He has many publications to his name, including Religious Liberty and International Law in Europe, Preventing Torture, Protecting Prisoners, Combating Torture in Europe, a manual on the wearing of religious symbols in public areas, and the optional protocol of the UN Convention Against Torture. He is also editor of the International Law and Blackstone's International Law Documents. Professor Evans, thank you very much for joining us. I want now to introduce to you Professor Zipeng He. He is Professor of International Law and Human Rights Law at School of Law, Jilin University, China, where he serves as the Dean of the School of Law. His main research interests are theories of international law, human rights, and legal education. He has published more than 200 academic articles and more than 20 books in these fields, with particular emphasis on the position and views of China. He is an executive board member of the Chinese Society of International Law, and he was promoted as the Changjiang Scholar, one of the top highest academic titles in China in 2016, and was selected as one of the top 10 jurists in China in 2017. He has published several books on human rights, including Basic Theories of Rights, Reflections and Reconstructions, Rights to Development and the System of the EU, Theoretical Issues of Human Rights, Globalization. So we have a wealth of experience in our two panelists, and I want to thank them both for their readiness to address this question of restoring international relations through the application and practice of international law. Can I please just say to all of the audience, if as the conversation progresses, you are filled with the urge to send in a comment, you can do that through the chat machine. It can be a comment or a question. I cannot promise that we will pick them up, but we will have a chance to gather those and reflect on them afterwards, even if not in the session. So please make use of the chat box if you would like to. The flow of the conversation will be, after a short introductory sentence from each of our panelists, I will turn to Professor Hay to make his presentation analysing and proposing routes to revitalising international cooperation. That will be for about 10 minutes. And then we will turn to Professor Evans, who will respond to the presentation in the form of some comments and some questions. And he will use his response time flexibly in a way that allows Professor Hay to respond to the questions as they unfold. So we hope that way it will be as much of a conversation as is possible. But to start with, please, can I ask you both very briefly, not more than 2 minutes each, because it's a big question, but it can't take too long. If you can briefly describe to us what factors inspired you to specialize in international law? What inspired you to go down this road? And in your opinion, after these years of experience that you've gathered in this field, what makes the issues of international law and global cooperation so critical in the present moment? So what inspired you years back? And what makes this field of research and practice so critical at this moment? So firstly, Professor Hay.
Thank you very much. I think recently we have experienced many challenges in international relations. For example, the war on terror and financial crisis, not just from the United States, but actually globally to the whole world. And then we have also witnessed the conflict of civilizations, as well as the conflict between ideologies. Then I think the world is actually in a critical time that we need to reevaluate the position of international law. So I think cooperation here is very critical because we need it. We needed to improve world order to achieve international rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hay. Okay, and to Professor Evans, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation here today. You asked first what inspired me to first study international law. I would love to say it was something hugely inspiring, but it really wasn't. When I did my undergraduate law degree, I will admit I loathed law, and the only bit of it which I discovered I actually really liked was international law. And so opportunities came for further study, and so it was clearly the only thing I was going to do, and I absolutely loved it. So I have to say there is no great philosophical reason that brought me into the discussion, but that I think is true of so many people who enter law, and I don't think it's necessary to hide that. Some accidents are very happy accidents, and I'm very happy with what happened. And particularly so about why it's so critical today, because it's difficult to think of any other single element, shall we say, of glue that resonates so widely as the idea of law. And in a divided world, it is, for most people, most of the time, for most countries, for most cultures, the idea of law is something that draws them together around the ideas of order, structure, unity, participation, fairness, etc., etc. And doubtless these are all things we'll touch on a little bit this morning. And so I think it is so absolutely critical today, because it is one of the very few things that I think most people, most states, most groups will reach out to as providing some place where they can all find some commonality. And that is so important for us all.
Thank you. Well, let's hope that we shall be able to tap into that vision of global community. And let's turn now to Professor Hay for your presentation, please. Over to you.
Thank you. I will share my screen. with you. I prepared a short slides for you, and then now we have it. Can you see these slides?
Yes.
Well, I would like to briefly explain the value of international law in extraordinary times. And firstly, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Evans, because I have read his books very early, since I undergraduate times, and when I graduate from school of law, I have really read so many books of Professor Evans. So in having this chance, I try to express my thanks to Professor Evans. And then come to my key point. My key point is here, cooperation may be regarded as one of the fundamental values in international law. That is to say, international law may cherish many values like freedom, like efficiency, like justice, but I think cooperation is a fundamental one. Without cooperation, the other values would not be possible, because international law today and international relations today is still in a very low level. I think we cannot really regard international law as a high developed legal system. And as many international relation theorists say, that international relations is still in the stage of anarchy. Therefore, cooperation is very basic, but it is very useful. Without cooperation, the other values may not be possible. And this is true even for today. So I had written a very short article last year, and it was published in the China Law Review. That is, Professor Evans have read the very brief English translation article. And here I would like to show you several of my thinkings on this point. The first one is why cooperation matters. In my opinion, cooperation is important in the following points. First one, we must know the context and nature of international law. When we think about the context of international law, we mean to say the international relations. We may define international law as the norms, rules, or legal system or legal process of international relations. Then international law lies in the context of international relations. As I have already mentioned, international relations is actually in a position, in a status of anarchy. That means there's no real world government. There's no higher authority accepted by all the states. There's no generally accepted international institutions which could get its higher status above states. So I think this afforded us a very important context to think about, to regard international law. And what should we understand the nature of international law? I just try to point out three. The first one is international law are rules based on consent. We all know, I think Professor Evans must be very familiar to this pacta sunt servanda. That means states need to keep their promise, but it also means without promise, there's no obligation. Of course, there are oppositions saying that some newborn states may also accept some obligations, but we say actually they must accept several obligations because that is the basis for their existence. But we may still regard this as a acceptance or consent. So international treaties, customary international law, and other types of international legal rules are actually based on consent. And then for the operation of international legal rules, actually they are rules based on, we can say, subjectivity. That is, there's no higher authority to rule the states. Or if we can come to Austin on his definition of law, it is the order of sovereign. But in international relations, there's no such a sovereign to give orders. So when we try to process international law, we must use intersubjectivity, that is to respect or self-restriction. Then international law are actually very weak rules. We cannot ask states to do so or not do anything without his or her consent. So I think international law is at a very primitive stage. It is not really matured system. And then I try to say that coercion of international law is not really provided. As I read the books of legal theory, I found that Kelsen regarded coercion as a very important nature of law. But in international relations, international law does not really owe this kind of power. Although Hans Kelsen once mentioned, when states try to defend themselves, use self-defense, it could also be regarded as coercion. But we know it is quite different from domestic legal system. And we also know from Hart, he said that the international legal rules are actually primitive because it lacks in secondary rules. Then we must accept the fact that international law is not really so mature. And then, as we have learned law, we know that there are many values like freedom, justice, order, and efficiency. But in my mind, all these values need to be further clarified in the context of international law. When I read Professor Stephen Neff's Justice Among Nations, Professor Stephen Neff is the author of Professor Evans' book, International Law. And he said that the process of international law may be regarded as a process of international justice. But I think we experienced really far from that because we are not quite agreed upon what is justice. So we have thoughts on international tribunals and courts. And when we talk about freedom, when we talk about order and efficiency, we all have problems upon them. So I think we need some basic values to define those values like freedom, justice, order, and efficiency. And then what can cooperation do? In my mind, if we accept Rosalind Higgins' understanding of international law as process and system, I think cooperation may enhance international legal process from a lower stage to a higher stage. Lower stage means competition and conflict, and higher stage means consensus and organization. If we understand international law as a system, I think cooperation may minimize fragmentation and make it more consistent system. So I think cooperation may do much for international law. And not really just for international law itself. it may also do something for international legal actors, mainly states. Because when we think about international law to settle issues between and among states, we may think about the very famous scholar Hugo Grotius. He have provided us a sovereign paradigm in international relations. But also we have Immanuel Kant. He provided us a cosmopolitan paradigm. And I think cooperation may try to make international law from Grotius' paradigm, that is a sovereign paradigm, to cosmopolitan paradigm, because states may have dialogues and cooperate to have a higher international legal system to enhance the human welfare. And then I would like to say that cooperation is not really the really best choice, but the second best. Since we are not really have a very good international legal system, cooperation may take the status quo a little better from anarchy to rule of law, or from a lower system of rule of law to a higher system. And then I would like to give you my conclusion on why cooperation is reiterated today. Because international law and international relations is actually in a position of anxiety. We experience deglobalization, not just in economic issues, but also in cultural and other issues. So it is necessary for states to have chance to, in their minds, to take cooperation seriously, and then to respect diversity of cultures. I think the respect of diversity of cultures is actually the basis for cooperation. Because without respect, we may just have pride and prejudice. My understanding is this: since we can understand LGBT and other individual choices, why cannot we understand the choice of states? And then with cooperation, we can make use of multilateral institutions, so to promote lawmaking, law compliance, and peaceful settlement of international disputes. And this is my stand. I try to have further questions and discussions with Professor Evans and the other audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Professor Evans, would you like to take the conversation forward, please?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you very much for that presentation. And I find myself in the unusual position of suddenly realizing that I'm an idealist, which is not something that I'm normally accused of being. I found it hugely helpful, that diagram you had at the end, where you had on the one side anarchy, and then on the other side law and cooperation sitting in the middle. And if we are having a debate today, I suppose it really comes down to where I suppose both of us feel we sit within that continuum. And I suppose, you know, where I'm coming from is perhaps overly optimistic, but I like to think we're a little bit further along towards, shall we say, the sphere of law, and a little further away from the sphere of anarchy than perhaps you know, your presentation would suggest. So this is my, I suppose, you know, idealist take on things. You know, I notice also that you talk about Rosalind Higgins' book. It's entitled Problems and Process. She saw, if you like, process as a solution to problems. I suppose what I tend to see over the years is actually almost the other way round, as process becoming part of the problem in terms of achieving of achieving outcomes. We live in a process obsessed age, and it just worries me that sometimes try to achieve, and therefore which we tend to achieve outcomes. And I think one of the questions I would like to really be raising here today is, to what extent are we seeing, could it be argued that the idea of cooperation is ultimately becoming, shall we say, not a means to an end, but just an end in itself? As long as we cooperate, then apparently everything is okay, or it's good, we are on the route to somewhere better, rather than reflecting on what is that end point. And I think that, you know, underlying that reflection is another, I suppose I would finger, sort of point of difference between perhaps where we are coming you know, entry into this discussion, and that really is, what is international law? Not what is it, but what is it for? And if one takes perhaps a slightly more, should we say, idealized approach, I could argue perhaps a more historical approach to what international law was. It was not what I would argue being, if you like, the classical model of international law, of sovereign states, the law between states, etc. If we look back far enough, we see the origins of the idea of international law in the jus gentium rather than the jus inter gentes, the law that stood above peoples, not the law of peoples, to pick up on the Rawlsian language. In other words, it was something that constrained what the powerful were able to do. In more modern language, it wasn't merely what states choose to be bound by, but was something that constrained states from acting in a way that was not in accordance with the fundamental, should we say, precepts of understanding of the limits of the rules of states, if you like. And so we have at heart, I think, you know, this profound debate about what is international law for. Is it to, if you like, coordinate the activities of states, as, you know, many have argued, and in your Anarchy to Law, it obviously resonates with Hedley Bull's The Anarchic Society, etc., etc. Or are we going back to, you know, other routes? Some would go back as far as, you know, Thomist routes, for example, in terms of thinking about what the nature and role of international law is in relation to those exercising sovereign power. Is it a facilitator of sovereign power, or is it a constraint on sovereign power? And I suppose, to me, I would want to anchor myself slightly more in the optimistic rule of law basket. Let's cooperate, get us out of anarchy basket. Paraphrase where we sit within this. You know, to me, cooperation is, of course, important, but where does it find its importance? You know, law, rule of law, is generally associated with constraint, and indeed, in some ways, coercion, as a means of trying to achieve an outcome. And the idea that international law isn't really law is really premised on the idea that we can't actually enforce it. Okay, but does that mean then we ought to perhaps think a little bit more about the difference of where cooperation sits in relation rules? That might be something of a halfway house. Understand that the world is made up of sovereign states, and the international law works within that space. And the role of states in terms of their consent to the substance of international law is very real. You mention treaty law, for example, being very contractarian in nature, as indeed is the case. Although I might point out that customary international law most traditionally although it is said to be based on the practice of states, increasingly is less based in state practice and more geared towards statements of, shall we say, what we understand in a slightly more visionary sense law is meant to be. Treaty law has possibly moved into the space where old-fashioned state practice and opinio juris used to sit, and customary international law possibly has moved through the idea of yes, cogens erga omnes obligations, etc., slightly more into that normative sphere rather than, should we say, deductive sphere with which it is normally associated. But we still do, even on the most narrow version, have understandings of international law that are not solely premised on the consent of states. But even if we take that, why, when it comes to when you do have clear international obligations, even if those are ones which are entered into by states freely, voluntarily, through a contractarian approach, through treaty, etc., should compliance with obligations actually be dependent on cooperation with states? Between states. To use a very simple domestic law analogy, if someone steals my car, I don't turn around to them, and say to them, look, let's have a conversation about this, shall we? If you've broken a clear obligation, then there should be a clear response. And I suppose that is where I do understand what you mean, that the failure of international law to be able to respond to that may be a problem. But is that really that is really an enforcement failure? And I'm not entirely sure that stepping back and just calling for cooperation at that point really addresses that problem. So whilst it may be that we can't impose obligations upon each other without cooperation manifested in consent to obligations, surely when it comes to the implementation of obligations which have been freely assumed, we might expect states to be, shall we say, constrained to comply in a way with their freely accepted obligations. And yet there is the danger that we are, through focusing on cooperation, making even compliance with our international obligations too focused on what states choose to wish to be not only bound by, but held to. And I think that is the big problem I have with, shall we say, some arguments around cooperation. There is a danger that it becomes a means of shall we say, exempting oneself from the fulfillment of the obligations which, as you rightly have said, should be pacta sunt servanda. You say no promise, no obligation. Absolutely. But perhaps we should say, if there is an obligation, it shouldn't just be a matter of cooperation, whether one can be held to perform it.
Okay, Professor Hay, do you want to come back on that whole area, which has really touched on the framework of international law, its authority and its capacity to deliver?
Yeah, I would like to thank Professor Evans for his really valuable questions. I think there's a very basic issue on how we understand the status quo of international law. As I think, although international law, if we start from Grotius' time or from Westphalia peace treaties, we can say we have around 400 years of development, but I think international law is not really highly in the rule of law stage. So this is why I stress international cooperation as the basic value. I noticed that Professor Evans paid attention to the restraint of sovereign power. That is to ask states to obey their obligations and to respect the rights of other states or the rights of the people. This is really a very good idea. I agree with this. However, I would like to say that international legal system today is not so mature to achieve this goal. The reason is that some very powerful states would not obey these rules, and some of those states would have a very bad example for the whole world. And so, although sometimes we try to establish a very high level of international legal ideal or principle, but sometimes those principles are abused. I would like to use the example of responsibility to protect the R2P. I think this is really a very good idea to all the states to respect and protect the human rights of their people. It's actually their basic obligation. This is good. And I agree on the fact that all governments should do so. But the further problem in international relations and international law is here. Some states may assert that one state had not really got have done the obligation very well, and then those states will do that work. That means they try to intervene in other states with armed forces. And up to now, I don't really see any unilateral or use of force by just several states are successful in any such states or places. So I think R2P is really a very good idea. However, the international society, as I understand, as an anarchy system or anarchy society, as Professor Evans just mentioned, cannot really allow these very good ideals to take place or to be realized. So I think other ideas are also in this way. For example, when we talk about the protection of the environment, we may have consensus on that. For example, climate change is really a very important issue. We need to do something to protect our environment, to stop climate changing. However, when we talk about the exact specific standards or criteria for states, they will say, sorry, we have very heavy development tasks, so I cannot really assume this kind of obligation. And I would like to say, these days, I feel very released because the new president of the United States just promised that he will rejoin the Paris Pact. I think this is a good thing. However, I do notice that internationally, there are still states thought on this kind of international arrangements. So in my mind, international law had done a lot to constrain states. However, they are not really so successful. So we need to go one step back to think about cooperative dialogue and discussion on what standards are really acceptable and how to achieve this kind of standards. So this is my first step response, Professor Evans.
Well, thank you. And I do understand what you mean. For the last 10 years, I have been chair of a United Nations body on torture prevention. And the way in which we work has been very much to try to work almost counter to what I was saying earlier, alongside states, working with them in a cooperative and collaborative fashion in order to find out what the drivers and things are on that may be causing torture or ill treatment within their countries to be taking place, and what can be done about it, and also that work is in fact confidential. So confidential, collaborative working with states that wish to do so. I absolutely understand how cooperation in difficult circumstances on difficult subjects can yield positive outcomes. In a sense, it's what I've been doing. And yet, partly because of what I've been doing in that way, I will admit to a high degree of practical frustration with those states that simply don't care about the promises that they've made. And certainly in the human rights sphere, many of the countries within who have ratified the treaty that I framework within which I work, when you actually tell them or remind them of what it is they've actually signed up to do, what they have freely committed themselves to do, you know, for quite a few, their initial response is, did we? Did we really? Why? And he says, well, the why is your question. My point is that you have. And so what are we going to do about it? And so, you know, for me, it really is, you know, a question of, well, you know, is it simply good enough when states have, you know, accepting state sovereignty, the state prerogatives, when states have freely accepted commitments and obligations, that they are still able to step back from them, and when there is an allegation that they have not been acting in conformity with that, that they simply can then step back and say, well, we are not cooperating. What do you do in a cooperative framework with states that will not cooperate with you, even in accordance with the processes that they have established? You know, you look at the number of, you know, cases, international litigation that comes up where states, shall we say, for some reason or another, okay, I understand that you can contest the jurisdiction of a court and tribunal. That's absolutely correct, that you should be able to do so to make sure it really has it. But then when some of them simply then just walk, when the finding has been made that indeed there is jurisdiction, they simply walk away from it and simply say, but we're not participating anyway. And when a result comes out, their answer is, well, we're just ignoring it anyway. Why? Because we disagree with the findings that have been made. That doesn't look like a reflection of a cooperative system of international law. And the danger then becomes that what to some appears a call for cooperation, to others looks like a simple device to be able to walk away from the commitments and obligations that one doesn't want to be held to according to what one has freely agreed to do. And that, I think, you know, is one of the difficulties that we face here. That the plea to cooperation, if you are looking at it, let us say, from the anarchic side of that diagram that you put, looks like a step forward. But if you're really trying to work from within the rule of law and holding, you know, states to account for the promises that they've made, the appeal to cooperation can look like stepping backwards rather than moving forwards. And of course, as you rightly say, you know, one of the difficulties with international law is we know that not all is equal in this regard. There will be questions about what is binding, what is not, in terms of obligations. Sometimes I absolutely agree, the international community pushes too far too quickly in terms of what states will take. Take the R2P, for example, the responsibility, you know, to protect. You know, I personally think, you know, brilliant idea, but, you know, pushing far too far, far too quickly, that wasn't going to happen. But you can expect states to be, shall we say, more cooperative with the systems and structures that they have agreed to freely and voluntarily than I think is often the case. And I'm just wondering, you know, how would you resolve this problem of states who simply refuse to cooperate with others, you know, around clear commitments that they have made to do so? And then perhaps after that, and I'm conscious of the time, it would be nice to spend a little bit of time talking about what I would call the international organization problem. Thank you.
Professor Hay.
Thank you, Professor Evans. This is really a very interesting question, and it is really tough because it reminds me the books of Immanuel Kant in his Perpetual Peace. He actually faced with this kind of question. That is, he did not approve wars against another state, but he tried to answer this question. If I want peace and the other states had no idea of peace, can we peacefully settle the problem? Right? Once they say, well, we will have peace, the other one say, I want war. So can you peacefully settle this problem? And I think this is also one of the questions in John Rawls' Law Among Peoples. So Rawls and Kant both faced with this kind of question. When we try to have a peaceful order, or as you say, when we try to have a cooperative order, but some states may say, I have no idea to do this. I just want to, for example, to go away from these international organizations or to go away international treaties. What can we do? My simple answer is that we have no idea. We cannot really do anything. We know that the previous years, the United States have actually done many cases for international lawyers. We know that we have treaties, we have international institutions, but they say, sorry, we have no interest. What can we do? So I think at this time, we may have several choices. The first one, we may try to persuade them. We may say, sorry, this is not a good behavior. Could you like to come back and we cooperate? And this actually is done. I also think the United Kingdom have done something to persuade the US to be a better guy in the international relations. And the other one is compulsory measures. For example, maybe some states may try to punish that states, but I don't really think that always works, especially for the most powerful states in the world. If that state try to say, I try to be an exceptional state, I try to avoid all international legal rules and institutions, I think the international society could not really come ask that state to obey the rules. And the third way is, for example, the other states unite and provide some pressures to that states. That is not really a friendly persuasion, but some pressure and not war. I think all these approaches may be useful, but the most impossible rule is to have international law work automatically to ask the state who had no idea to cooperate to come back to cooperate. So my idea is that cooperation is not really easy, and we need intersubjectivity. That is, for example, peers pressure to those states who had no ideas to cooperate, to change its behavior. It won't be always successful, but it would work in some ways. This is my understanding, Professor Evans.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, for some, cooperation is a vehicle by which there is, should we say, equality around a table. And this is often reflected in international organizations, etc., and people think these are neutral venues to which people can come, and it has an equalizing effect, etc., I would sort of like to think that, but I'm not sure that I do. You know, certainly in my experience, that who is it who tends to call for cooperation the most? People who tend to call for cooperation generally, actually, in international sphere, tend to be the powerful states. It's not the weak, funnily enough, it's not weak states who want cooperation. Weak states want the rule of law. In other words, they want to appeal to law to protect them against the powerful. You know, at one level, it's what law has always done. You know, it's tried to be, and certainly human rights and others, it's meant to be a bulwark of the vulnerable against the powerful. And it tends to be the powerful who don't actually like that very much. Let's go back to Thucydides and the Melian debate. You know, it's never really been bettered. You know, the strong do what they must, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, and you know, and rules go out the window. So it tends to be, you know, the vulnerable who actually benefit from this. And so whenever I will admit that when I see appeals to, to cooperation, what I tend to see are strong states wanting to call for cooperation, knowing full well that that means you are stepping outside what we could call the rule of law framework, when 1,000 other influences can come into play in order to gain their cooperation. There are many ways in which you can get cooperative outcomes. In United Nations, in international settings, we talked about freely given consent of states. What nonsense. So many international conventions are not signed by states freely. In my area, the human rights world, they're signed because pressure is put on states to sign, because they want to be seen to be, because they need to be seen to be signing. It's not because they freely subscribe to what is there. When we work within international organizations, we all know these are terribly politicized and non-transparent organizations, and can so often just become other vehicles through which political pressures can be made to look collaborative and cooperative, when indeed they're not. Look at regional and block voting systems within the UN, weighted voting, quotas, cronyism, lacks of meritocracy in so many of them, etc., etc. Not to mention, and I don't mind saying this, the rank hypocrisy that one sees in them all too often. For the last 10 years, I have made an annual presentation to the UN General Assembly concerning issues of torture, and I will say what I have to say, I hope ever so politely, and I will get all sorts of states saying from the floor how vital is the work that we are doing, and how what we are doing is so important, and they support us so absolutely fully, they stand fully behind us. And I know, because I have been there, that they don't. But that's just the way of it. What do we do when cooperative fora just become another way in which the reality can just get, shall we say, marginalized?
So that does take us very nicely onto this whole question of what to do with the UN and what to do with international organizations, because they are a part of this system, but sort of quasi something else.
I should say, I'm not against them. I'm all for understanding what they can and can't do.
Do you think that the fault mostly lies with international organizations, or are there a plethora of problem points? The disconnect, for example, between national and international law systems is one disconnect, but another does seem to be at this international level, where there's conflict of norms, and the instruments for resolving conflicts of norms, many of them UN agencies, seem to be quite at a loss as to what to do. What's your impression, Professor Hay?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are several questions. I would like to begin with a vulnerable issue. I agree with Professor Evans on the point that sometimes the vulnerables would like to use law as its reliance. But I would like to say that we must have those legal mechanisms to protect the vulnerables, so that the vulnerables may rely on. We may take the example of Nicaragua versus the United States. At that time, the United States accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. So Nicaragua may sue the US. But thereafter, the United States never or rejected this kind of jurisdiction. So other states may not have this kind of opportunity. I would like to say that rule of law is, of course, a better choice than cooperation. And I agree on the point that vulnerable states would rely on rule of law. But the problem is that in many fields of international issues, there's no such arrangement. So this is my understanding. And then when we talk about international organizations, I have the same idea with Professor Evans, because I think some international organizations at the very beginning have a very good design, but by and by, the fora becomes more and more politicalized. So those states just try to negotiate their own issues without really further abide legal rules. This is not a very good thing, but in my mind, to have international institutions and organizations still provided a channel for states to have their ideas. Just as Professor Evans talked about, for example, the torture issue. Maybe we have international organizations and we ask the government to explain. The governments may say, sorry, what are you saying? Do we really have this kind of problems? From the first level, they may do like this, but I have cooperated with the government officials for a very long time. I know that internationally they may act like this, but domestically they may also ask the officials. Well, we are criticized in international organizations to have these and these problems. We should change. So you can find out that the human rights level in many states are actually become better and better. So I think international pressure, not really in judicial or compulsory manner, just in dialogue manner, may be better. This is my understanding on this issue.
Yeah.
Professor Evans, what's your line on this? Do you think that the end goal of cooperation is to have a regulator or authority that can resolve these disputes? Or is the mode of cooperation always ultimately, as Professor Hay is saying, it's a kind of a restorative conversation that somehow will ultimately have the moral weight?
Well, in all things, there must be, should we say, the equivalent of checks and balances at some point. And the idea of some, shall we say, institutional behemoth that from, some point on the planet was able to run roughshod over, overall in the interests of justice. I'm not entirely sure I would buy into that one too. The world is a complex place, and we live in community, we live in society, and the importance of community and of society has got to be reflected. It needs to be respected. The question is how we strike that balance without ending up in the, if you like, in the pits of anarchy, rather than, if you like, because law can produce its own tyranny too, and we need to understand that. And so I do think that there is a very powerful place for cooperation, between nations, between states, between peoples, but it's a question of understanding what it is it's meant to be delivering. And I think the problem, the issue for me is to try to be clear that, as I said at the outset, that cooperation can't just be seen as an end in itself. It needs to be, shall we say, a tool that delivers something positive. And all that I'm really anxious for is that the idea of cooperation isn't used to, if you like, to undermine or have the practical impact of undermining the, should we say, the rule of law. The ideal would be the impartial, effective administration and enforcement of the international rule of law in the international sphere. It's not, and to me, I would think trying to do that better, rather than thinking, well, the best we can do is try to cooperate because we're not yet reached that point where we can aspire to make the organs and the engines of international governance more responsive and reflective the needs of people, of the realities of culture, social ordering, etc., etc. So I don't want to go down the monolithic world governance route where some group of unaccountable people make all these decisions for us. No, 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 no. But at the same time, what we don't want, I think, is a means that is so anchored in, let us call it a dangerous concept of cooperation.
Yeah.
Powerful way, not derogation, while the weak and vulnerable of law because they don't think it can actually deliver for them.
Professor Hay, the last word is to you. What would you like to say in response finally? Do you share that optimism that we will get to a state of maturity where there is more than just goodwill, there is actually a real breakthrough in terms of cooperation?
Yes, I agree with Professor Evans on the point that cooperation is not really the end. It is just the means or the tunnel or the way to rule of law. We both, all of us actually cherish or think rule of law or rule of good international law is our good ideal. I hope that day may come based on a better conversation, dialogue, negotiation, practice, and of course, cooperation. Thank you.
And I thank you both very much indeed. And thank everybody for joining us on this occasion. Do join us for the next conversation, which will be in 2 weeks' time. This time, in 2 weeks, we will have our second conversation when we will be looking at questions of ecological sustainability. So thank you again, and I wish you well. Bye-bye.